So, the last time Pixar took audiences on a journey to outer space, it didn't go so well, to put it mildly. Just kind of surrounded by controversy, Lightyear was a massive box office flop that, crashed and burned before ever leaving the atmosphere, and I think did cause many family audiences just to question whether Pixar had finally lost its golden touch. Well, the question now is, has the studio learned the right lessons from that failure? Or is its latest film, Elio, destined for another crash landing? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So, kind of like post Lightyear, the narrative of Pixar's demise did begin to improve with 2023's Elemental movie, which I happen to like quite a bit. But really, it was last year's mega hit film, Inside Out 2, that did demonstrate that the studio is back in fine form, having clearly sort of learned the right lessons from its past failures. And now, Elio, the studio's second voyage into space, I think keeps that positive momentum going, because I think this movie is just really good. I think bolstered by very beautiful visuals and a very heartfelt and timely story, and just a hefty dose of that Pixar magic. Elio soars as what I think to be one of the better animated films in the last few years. The film asks the age-old question, are we really alone in the universe? And Elio hopes the answer is a very emphatic no, because the kid is just dying to meet some aliens. And really much of this film's charm is kind of subverting the sci-fi genre norms and centering on a character who actually wants to be abducted. And when, spoiler alert, he eventually does get his wish, it's everything he hoped it would be. I've appreciated after getting a DNA sample taken from his nose, he excitedly declares, "My first probe." I think so his unwavering enthusiasm is just infectious, and I think makes him a very worthy addition to kind of Pixar's sprawling cast of quirky and memorable characters. Of course, in classic Pixar fashion, there's a lot going on beneath the immediate surface of aliens and UFOs, because at its core, I think Elio is a film just about loneliness and social isolation, because the real concern is not whether we are alone in the universe, but whether we are alone in our own lives here down on Earth. And in a way, sort of the search for life in the cosmos acts as a very powerful metaphor just for Elio's own internal yearning and for acceptance and belonging in the aftermath of the tragic death of his parents. Now, if you've been following this channel for a while, you know that I've criticized Pixar in the past for sometimes aiming just a bit over the heads of its younger audience demographic with its very mature themes and messaging, such as Woody's essentially existential crisis in Toy Story 4. But I think Elio does confront a very universal and relatable struggle that I think both old and young viewers can resonate with. I think at times we all feel sort of alone in the universe and just want to be noticed and accepted. And at their best, I think Pixar films are emotionally rich enough to make grown adults cry. Because man, those first 15 minutes of Up pack a punch. But I think they're also kind of bursting with enough quirky fun and inventive action to keep younger viewers entertained. I think Elio has the mature themes down, and while I do think the story is consistently amusing, it did feel a little bit muted to me. The film is engaging, I think largely due to the vibrant visuals and just Elio being a likable protagonist, but the story almost feels stuck in first gear, just never quite ramping up the action or the stakes the way that I kept waiting for it to do. And in that way, I think perhaps the climactic third act sequence in this is a fitting representation of just the film as a whole, because that scene sees the heroes aboard a spacecraft receiving coordinates from Earth to just help them frantically navigate a debris field, and as help is radioed in from individuals really spanning all across the globe. It's a beautiful moment that I think perfectly sort of encapsulates the film's central message that we are not as alone as we may think. The problem is it's just not overly exciting to watch. And when the end credits rolled, I immediately thought, wow, that was a really charming film. But I think were I to rewatch it or to take my two kids to see it for the first time, I struggle to think of any particular scene or joke or moment that I would be excited to experience again. I think maybe to give a different metaphor, I think this movie is maybe more akin to a solid musical album that is filled with plenty of enjoyable tracks, but just no standout hit radio singles. But part of what makes this film immersive and fun, despite its somewhat undercooked story, are the gorgeous visuals. And I know we've all sort of become, I think, accustomed, like desensitized to just impressive animation these days. But this movie just looks really, really great. I think especially sort of like its depictions of space. At the same time, while the film is filled with a lot of like vibrant spectacle, the like world building elements don't actually go very deep. I think other kind of Pixar films like Soul or Elemental or even like the Inside Out movies all offered very immersive and like fully developed imaginative worlds. I think kind of in contrast, Elio feels more like a collection of like visual ideas rather than it does like a cohesive world. I think it kind of has all the like, otherworldly fun of the famous cantina scene in Star Wars, but without sort of that lived in quality that makes it ever feel like a real place. The story's like primary setting, the Communiverse, which is like a planet-like ship where the brightest minds across the galaxy gather to, share ideas, I think is itself an exciting idea, but really after like a quick initial tour of it, we never really see like the inner workings of it again. And I know the story like, isn't really about the world as much as it is, about the characters, and it does do that part, I think, really well. I just personally would have still liked to see like, a little bit more of that same like attention to detail and like cleverness that other Pixar films have shown. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of it, really not a whole lot here. For language, there's no profanity, although you do have a character who repeats the phrase, "oh my gosh," a couple times, and there are a scattering of other kind of rude words like "but." As far as violence goes, you have like the leader of a warlike species of aliens who, essentially the main like antagonist in the film, who kind of in several occasions uses another like miniature cute looking alien species as target practice, although those aliens are not like killed or like seriously harmed in the act. Probably the most like intense depiction of violence isn't actually depicted like on screen, it's more implied, but you have sort of like a grub slug like alien species that wears like armored carapace, and like the process of entering into that armor is quite horrific. Essentially, gives off the impression of like a old school like medieval torture chamber where they enter in and sort of walls and doors filled with spikes slowly close in and puncture the creatures and sort of hold them in place. And while you don't actually see the spikes, enter the creature, you do sort of see the chamber closing in around one. And maybe the only other kind of instance of violence in this is you have sort of a human clone that accidentally cuts off his finger, although there's no blood because he's not actually a human, before like picking it up and sticking it back on. As far as sexuality, nothing going on in this film for that. The only other kind of like content thing to be aware of, especially if you're the parent of like younger children, is there are several moments that I think might be quite frightening for those younger viewers, including one scene featuring sort of the human clone character that seems to be inspired by or like, reminiscent of like classic zombie films. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface, as I said earlier, I think Elio is a story kind of fundamentally just about loneliness and like isolation. And kind of in some recent interviews, some of Pixar's like chief storytelling executives have declared their intentions to, return to focus more on like universal storytelling. I think giving some of the sobering statistics and research in recent years about, the current so-called like epidemic of loneliness, I think Elio might be one of Pixar's most relatable stories yet. The movie may have like a very cosmic scope, but really like Elio's journey is a deeply like, personal and like internal one. And I've seen some Christians already kind of try to apply a very religious like framework to this story. And to be fair, like the film itself kind of opens that door because there's like a repeated voiceover that kind of bookends this film that suggests that like, the question of whether we are truly alone in the universe is one sort of at the heart of superstitions and also science and lastly religion. But personally, I think attempting to like interpret this film as some sort of like Christian allegory of a boy who like finds ultimate belonging by looking to the heavens does quickly kind of break down the further that allegory is stretched. And I think like, in some ways, the main message to me actually seems to be like the opposite of that we don't need to look upwards, but instead need to learn to like appreciate, the life and community that we have on Earth. So to me, I think it's more a message of just having a healthy perspective, kind of a less like overtly religious, but I think equally a biblical theme. And in one of like what I thought to be this movie's best moments, Elio finally learns to like look past his own pain and kind of recognize the struggle and like sacrifices of his aunt, who is sort of his like surrogate guardian. And the movie doesn't like judge Elio for this. Like, the kid has had a hard go of it, but it does demonstrate, I think, just how loneliness can lead us to act selfishly and like become so focused on our own desires that we're blind to the needs of the people around us. And ultimately, like both Elio and his aunt come to terms with not having the exact life that they may have envisioned for themselves by shifting their perspective to like the blessings of the lives that they do have. And biblically, I think this film echoes like the Apostle Paul's sentiment in Philippians 4, where he says, "I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all things through him who gives me strength." I think as this movie demonstrates, like hardships are real and like life is challenging, but God is good and there is joy and like beauty in the world around us if we look at it with the right perspective. So in the end, I think Pixar's second journey into space may be a little bit more like Katy Perry's Blue Origin spaceflight than it is Neil Armstrong's monumental Apollo 11 moon landing, but I still think Elio is another really like entertaining animated story. And like interestingly, behind the scenes, the film actually like changed key members of its creative team. Like midway through production underwent several delays, and I do think it shows kind of both for better and for worse, because there are some excellent like seeds of inventive ideas and I think a very clear identity with its core message, but just not always a singular like a direction for how to explore those ideas to their fullest potential. Even so, I think Elio is a really good, if not great, animated film with a timely message that just reminds viewers that we don't need to look, to extraterrestrial life in the stars to find belonging, but instead we can find it in the people that God has placed in our lives all around us. But hey, I would love to hear what you think if you enjoyed this film as much as I did, or maybe you think it falls short of sort of the standard that Pixar has established. So don't be shy, jump into the comment section, let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so too, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider, got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching, stay safe, and continue to collide through World for Christ.